We live in unsustainable times, and I think most people recognize that. I don't know any of you except for Florian and Sebastian, and I've created a presentation that's probably going to be around 30 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes. For those of you not familiar with my work, we'll integrate how everything is connected. And then the last part, we'll talk about how do we think about investing and philanthropy and technology and the areas that society needs steering and shifting of priorities. And it's not 4 hours old. It's about 37 minutes old from when I finished it. So bear with me if there are formatting errors or anything like that. We have consumed beyond our means for a generation. We're pulling that forward with credit. I think Gaia probably talked about that with the limits to growth. Part of the message I'm going to tell you today is there is an interrelationship between energy and technology. And a lot of our technological plans for the near future and the distant future are subsidized by a reality that most people are unaware of, that every single year, with the exception of COVID 2020, with the exception of the Great Financial Crisis 2009, with the exception of 3 years in the 1970s, a few years in the 1930s, and the two world wars, other than those exceptions, we have had more energy used as a global culture every single year in the last 150 years. And I'm going to talk about how that energy has underpinned not only our lifestyles, but also our expectations and our stories. And in the not too distant future, we will have to use technology and innovation in a time with less energy every year. And what does that mean, and what are the options? So here we go with a whirlwind presentation, investing in philanthropy at the peak of the carbon pulse. So here's a relatively unknown quote by Einstein. If I had only 1 hour to save the world, I would spend 55 minutes defining the problem and then 5 minutes finding the solution. That's what I'm going to do today, 25 minutes defining the problem. So we live in a society that has rewarded reductionist expertise. We have lots of experts and different topics, world famous, high status people telling stories about their expertise. But what ends up happening is these people rarely get in a room and talk to each other and go up another higher level. So we have all these confident, charismatic humans opining about the future without integrating how the topics fit together and what that integrated perspective suggests about the future, which is what I'm going to attempt to do today. And I'm still learning. Thomas and Sebastian mentioned I have a podcast. I've learned a lot from my guests on things I didn't think about and didn't know, and I continue to learn. But what I've tried to assemble these last 20 years since I left Wall Street is a comprehensive picture of the human and planetary predicament. A simplified version not taught in our economic textbooks is that humans have ideas and innovate, and we combine energy and materials to invent products. And we overlay that with financial markers, whether it's euros or yen or dollars. And we do this all to generate the same emotional states in a novel environment as our ancestors. And the whole thing produces waste and pollution. Many of you that are familiar with my work, this next few minutes will be review, but I think especially what's happening with Russia, NATO, and Europe, I want to highlight some of these points. Energy is fundamental in nature, and it's fundamental to human societies. Every single good that contributes to GDP in the world needs energy to invent, to get the materials, to combine, to create, to manufacture, to deliver, to maintain, to repair, to dispose of. Energy is primary in our economies. A human body without energy is a corpse. A piece of technology without energy is a sculpture. A city without energy is a museum. This is my farm. This is me. I can do the work on a good day of 1/10 of one horse. This is my horse Binga, which does the work, if she's properly motivated, by butterscotch treats of one horse. This is my utility vehicle with a little bit of gasoline. It does the work of 45 horses. And this is my truck with this amount of diesel fuel can do the work of 300 horses. The next time you're flying, imagine 100,000 horses invisibly pulling that jet across the sky. That is the amount of energy dense power that we get from this ancient sunlight, as Sebastian mentioned, is 10 million times faster being pulled out of the ground than it was sequestered. So 1 barrel of oil within it contains the energy potential, the work potential of 5.7 million BTUs. And if you translate that into kilowatt hours of work, it's around 1,700 kilowatt hours compared to one of us working for a 9-hour day generate around 6/10 of 1 kilowatt hour. So if you do the math, and of course humans are more efficient than fossil fuels, so you have to handicap that a little bit. 1 barrel of oil, currently $80, does about 4.5 years of our physical work. If you multiply that out, human society globally right now uses around 100 billion barrel of oil equivalents of coal, natural gas, and oil. And if you do the math of that, we are effectively subsidized by the labor equivalent of 500 billion human workers, which are added on top of 5 billion real human workers. So this really is the story of industrialization, where we replace tasks that humans used to do with machines with vast amounts of almost free, but not quite free, fossil fuels. We had the spinning looms and industrial train system, the locomotives, and now very highly energy intensive tasks like air travel or aluminum smelting. Sebastian and Florian, apologies for you seeing this graph like 19 times, but I think it's important, especially with what's going on in Europe. This is a story of how we make profits and how our goods and services have skyrocketed. If you take an example, I live in Wisconsin in the United States, which is a dairy state. If you hand milk a cow, there is no external energy applied. You make $5 an hour. If you add intermediate technology where there are machines that milk the cows, it uses 180 times more energy, but your hourly wage goes up to $20. Then if you add a fully automated milking machine where there's hardly any human input at all, machines do everything, that uses 400 times more energy than the original human. But now you're approaching $25 an hour in wages. That wage number can be allocated to the employees, to the business owner, or to society in the form of lower priced milk. Look at the blue bars. That's the chart I just showed you. When energy prices double, say from 5 to 10 cents a kilowatt, that's the orange bars. And the middle graph shows a decline in profits because you're higher costs on some of your inputs. And then on the very high automated scenario, when you double your cost, the orange graph shows that your profits decline dramatically. But when you triple the cost of energy, of course, the hand milking stays the same because you don't have any additional energy. You have smaller profits in the intermediate example. But now, because you're adding so many thousands of units of fossil labor to the machines hungry for it, you now are operating at a loss in the high energy intensive scenario. This is what started to happen in Europe and particularly in Germany, that was heavily dependent on automated things requiring electricity and energy, especially chemical plants. So later last year, there was a lot of companies folded up or had lower profits because their major input had more than tripled in price. This is going to be an unfolding story in coming years. So what this means is, in combination, the last couple centuries is we had a boost in wages, a boost in profits, a reduction in the price of things and a massive scaling in the human enterprise. Relative to 500 years ago, the human economy now, which is the number of people times the average consumption per person, is 1,000 times bigger than in the year 1500. Economic textbooks, and I have an MBA from the University of Chicago, they never mentioned the word energy in the 2 years I was there. Economic textbooks assume that the dollar cost of energy is its contribution to our economy. So $1,000 worth of coal or gas is equal to $1,000 worth of cell phones or beer mugs or cupcakes or whatever else has a dollar value on it. The reality is, in Economics 101, they treat that there is a circular economy, that households demand things, firms get the signal, they create them, and it's a virtuous cycle between firms and households. The reality is this model, taught around the world still today, neglects the source, which is this fossil energy and materials, which I'll get to in a minute, and the sink, which is the environmental waste absorption. So we are conflating, as a culture, the dollar value of energy with the work value that it provides us. And we don't include the cost of pollution at all. As a culture, we are energy blind. So what we're doing is drawing down this Earth's battery of stored energy-dense carbon so fast, it's given us so many benefits that we have a cultural narrative that this is the interest and it's ongoing, when in reality, we're drawing down a finite pool of capital and considering it as interest. As Sebastian mentioned, if you take a bird's eye view of many thousands of years, we are all on this Zoom call today, alive somewhere between the blue and the red dots of drawing down this pulse of ancient carbon. From a climate change perspective, we probably hope we're at closer to the red star, so we will have less emissions in the future. From an economic growth perspective, we hope we're at the blue star because we need this highly dense, transportable at room temperature energy to continue to power our economies. For now, oil is the economy because of how dependent the world is on transportation. This shows a logarithmic chart of the relationship between oil consumption on the bottom graph and GDP on the left graph. And you can see that on a logarithmic chart, it's got a 0.96 R squared. There are narratives that technology is overcoming depletion of oil. And for instance, the United States peaked in oil production in 1970, and then we declined all the way until 2007 or so. But since then, we have overcome with fracking and horizontal drilling and things like that, and technology has overcome depletion. Well, if you look at that exact same graph and break it out by geological province, the green is the conventional crude oil in the lower 48 states. The orange is Alaska, which is a completely different contiguous region, non-contiguous, but it's part of the country, the United States. The blue is under the Gulf of Mexico in the ocean, and the red represents what's called tight oil or shale oil. And this is where the source rock originated. This is where all the other oil migrated from, and this stuff depletes very rapidly. So the two narratives here are drill, baby, drill. Look at how great we are. But the reality, if you look deeper, is we're draining America first. This chart shows that all the wells in the gray that were drilled prior to 2014 decline at a certain pace. And then we drill more wells. New wells overcome some of that depletion, but the new wells drilled in every single year, we have to drill more and more because they deplete faster and faster. You can see the blue on the far right. The wells that were drilled at the beginning of 2021 decline almost 50 or 60% in the first year, and then we have to drill more. So if for environmental reasons, for loss of capital reasons, for any other reasons, if the United States, to give one example, were to stop drilling for oil today, our production as a country would drop by 37% in the first year, and then another double digits the second year and another double digits after that. So we have to keep drilling in order to maintain or even stem the decline of what we're producing. GDP and energy are incredibly tightly linked. Over time, we get more efficient at using energy because of our technology, but globally, the relationship between energy and GDP is 99% plus, 99.3% over the last 50 years. The relationship between materials like copper, asphalt, lumber, glass, or concrete, the relationship between materials and GDP is 1-for-1. So if we double our economy, we're going to double the amount of materials that are used. The relationship between carbon, which is the dotted green line here, isn't as tightly linked because we are growing our non-carbon inputs faster than we're growing our economy, but there is a very, very heavy material linkage to economic growth. We get a little bit more efficient every year. This shows the 200-year history of how much energy it takes to generate a unit of GDP, and the dotted black line shows that the energy intensity of our economy is declining, meaning every year we're getting a little bit more efficient. But the stacked colors show that every single year we're using more energy in total. So since 1995 to 2022, we became, as a global culture, 33% more efficient in how we used energy. And during that same period, we grew our total energy use by 50%. So technology does not have us use less energy. It's part of a global system that's growing our energy vector. Really briefly on money, most of you by now probably know this. The majority of our money isn't lent from existing capital. It is actually created. Commercial banks making loans create money. From a financial standpoint, the assets and the liabilities are balanced when a new loan is made. But from a biophysical standpoint, when a new $10 million comes into existence, the same amount of oil, copper, forests, and dolphins existed as the day before. This is a challenge when we look at the world from a biophysical perspective. Stephanie advised me to shorten my presentation, so I took out my 15 slides on human behavior, but in effect, humans go through our lives matching the emotional states of our ancestors. We're not going through our life trying to maximize our biological fitness. We're executing adaptations that made our ancestors successful. Among them, we care about social status a lot. We compare ourselves to others. We have a list of cognitive biases as long as my arm. We care about the present more than the future. We can be hijacked by supernormal stimuli. We're incredibly tribal. We follow the herd and look at what other people are doing. I don't think I need to spend a lot of time on this with this group, but it's not only carbon is our pollution. We have other impacts on nature as well, and they are accelerating. There are the chemical and endocrine disrupting aspects of fossil fuels. Sperm count is dropping by over 1% a year. This is now global, and it's not just humans, it's animals. Oceans have absorbed over 90% of the heat and are acting as a temporary buffer. Ocean oxygen content is already down 2%, 20% in the shallows. We've lost 70% on average of animal, fish, bird, and amphibian populations since 1970. You all are aware of these things that are not included in our economic prices, but are extremely important, the most important to me. All this together is this human ecosystem, and we keep track of this by GDP. Globally, that would be gross world product. Well, it turns out that because GDP and energy are so tightly linked, every single good that is in our economic output on the planet started somewhere with a small fire. GDP might as well be called GWB, gross world burning. It is that tethered. So much like the hemoglobin in our bodies transports oxygen throughout our bodies in the veins and arteries, we have veins and arteries of our economic system. This is an aerial view of Los Angeles. The headlights and the brake lights of cars powered by the hemoglobin of our energy source, which is gasoline, which comes from oil. Zooming out, we've created tens of thousands of global transport, 6-continent complex supply chains that are dependent on this fuel. So I wrote an academic paper on the fact that all of this together produces an emergent result that global human culture is functioning as an energy dissipating structure, kind of like a mindless amoeba, not paying attention to the well-being or the wants and needs of its constituent parts, us, but following the dictates of the market, which is compelled to grow based on momentum, metabolism, and prior claims. An uncomfortable conclusion from this is there is no one driving the bus, not politicians, not billionaires. We have outsourced our decision-making to the market. Okay, another way to look at all this is a conceptual graph over time of hydrological flows that were sustainable in human society. And then we found, via drilling under the earth, we found things that are natural resources that form a Gaussian distribution. There's a little bit at the start, and then we get more efficient and need it, and it reaches a peak, and then it declines, like oil or copper or something like that. This is another way of showing the carbon pulse. Then we've overlaid a monetary abstraction on top of this in order to bring resources to the present. Banks don't loan existing money. Banks create money, which is more claims on this red curve. So with access to fossil fuels, our system in the last 150 years grew so fast that land no longer explained our wealth, so it became capital and labor. And we've added the social construct of credit, therefore continually pulling resource consumption forward in time. And our entire world now views our situation from a financial lens. We have not only financialized the human experience, but also the explanation of it. All of our key decision makers, and I've met with many MPs in Europe and congressmen and senators in the United States, and most of them are flanked by either an economist or an MBA, and most of them expect this black line to continue into the future. There is no credible institution or government body or corporation globally that is specifically planning for an end to growth. And yet, growth long-term was not the norm. It was an anomaly. We are now living an anomaly. There were many periods in human past when there was flat or negative growth for a very long time. And all of our economic and financial fancy models were developed in this little red square in the recent 50 years or so. So the highest growth rate in human history peaked in the 1970s, which is exactly when oil production growth peaked. And we're still growing. We're still having productivity, which is a function of energy cost, material cost, and technological innovation. If you aggregate that all together, we're still becoming more productive, but at a declining rate. And at some point, the energy and material depletion will overtake the technological innovation, and we will have a reduction in productivity because these 500 billion workers will either be asking for pay raises or retiring. So what we're doing now in Europe, in the UK, in the United States, in Japan, in China, is we're papering over our problems with more and more credit while the energetic material basis of our currencies deplete. So under this framework of a superorganism, what is not likely to happen? Growing the economy and mitigating climate change and the sixth mass extinction, growing the economy by replacing fossil fuels with renewables. Renewables are robust and mature, but by growing them, we're helping the economy, but we're growing our overall energy use. We're not replacing fossil fuels. We're adding to the whole mix. What else isn't going to happen? Culture isn't going to decide to leave fossil fuel in the ground, and governments are not going to embrace limits to growth before limits to growth are well past. Under this framing, what is likely to happen? Growth in the gross amount of energy while the net amount of energy declines. Gross energy contributes to GDP, but it means that more and more energy will be directed to the energy mining material sector, which means it has to come away from The rest of society, arts and leisure and hospitals and soccer stadiums and libraries and all that will be priced out of energy because it will have to go to the energy sector. We will have, as recent years attest, massive money creation and financial market support by central banks, governments, modern monetary theory, et cetera, basic income and support for more people, probably a rightward shift in politics because rightward politicians will promise people what they want today, whereas some of the more liberal things that care about the future, because of our steep discount rates, that won't be as salient unless something happens, and probably a reduction in global environmental regulations. In short, as a global culture, we will be pedal to the metal until we hit a wall. There are two main scenarios that I see. Let me give a brief historical analog, because some of you who've never heard me before might think that I'm telling some sort of a neo-Malthusian story. But let's talk about Malthus briefly, shown in the far left red line. Thomas Malthus had some strange ideas, but basically that the demand for food would outstrip the ability to grow food. Well, he was wrong, because he didn't know about the ancient carbon that we would vertically mine from the earth in addition to horizontal mining in the soil. In the 1970s, Paul Ehrlich wrote a book about the population bomb. He was wrong because he didn't know about globalization, that we outsource to the cheapest areas, nor did he know about debt. Every single year since he wrote The Population Bomb, the global economy has grown our debt more than we've grown our GDP. We hit another wall in the great financial crisis in 2009. Central banks took over the role of money creation and money guarantees from commercial banks. This went into turbocharge in the year 2020, where we had these bazookas of stimulus to support the economies. How many more cans are left to kick? If we grow at 3% a year, we will double the energy and materials needed for a global society by the year 2050 and double it again by the year 2080. Is this possible? Is this desirable? I think that scenario one is, if we're able to continue this productivity growth, we will gradually turn into this Mordor-like economy. And last night I did a Frankly podcast on that topic, which will be out this Friday, that we will continue to grow gross energy while a larger and larger percentage of our economy is the energy and materials sector. And also a larger sector will be environmental remediation to help with some of the environmental damages. It will be a vastly different economy. This is possible. The other scenario, which personally I think is inevitable, is when we remove low productivity credit, which is right now freely available around the world, with a shift towards lower productivity, in other words, more costly energy and resources because of fossil depletion, and a return to solar inputs like renewables, we will have a 30% plus or minus reduction in the size of the economy, akin to the 1930s situation, because we have been kicking these financial claims on our energy reality for a very long time, and there is a bill coming due. When we talk about the future, some sustainable city in the future, what does Europe and Earth look like 30 years from now? What is the scale of our living circumstances? What's the energy mix? What is our cultural aspiration? What does the equality look like? The environment? What sort of governance structure? So we have several roadblocks between what we plan now and our future that we're considering. Among them, I haven't talked about it today because I don't have enough time, is we no longer trust our fellow countrymen and women because of the polarization in algorithms and social media, although the algorithms did connect Thomas and I, so there are some benefits, but people don't trust what they read anymore. This is a central problem. As I mentioned, there is this financial recalibration where the rubber band of financial claims snaps back to what our underlying biophysical reality can support. as everyone is hopefully paying attention to right now, with the thin fig leaf of a proxy war going on between the United States and Russia in the country of Ukraine, is we have to avoid the mother of all risk, which is a nuclear escalation. And we have to have ongoing adaptation to a changing climate. And climate is just one of many environmental stressors. Okay, conclusions, and then I'm going to get to what this means for investors and philanthropists. Briefly, our culture is energy blind. We conflate technology and money and our own cleverness with the energetic and material underpinnings of our civilization. Climate is one of many symptoms of ecological overshoot, and we're overly focused on climate as if we could keep everything else the same and just optimize for climate. We're part of a system, and climate is downstream of our economic system. Growth is probably over in coming decades, but no one is planning for that. The next doubling is unlikely to happen, and if it does, it will squeeze out what's left of nature, in my opinion. We are slowly becoming aware that the well-being of our citizens and of nature is not being addressed by just a measure of our cultural aspirations of how much stuff we burn. Renewables are the right answer to the wrong question. Renewables are robust and viable and relatively inexpensive given what we had a long time ago, but renewables will not power a 19 terawatt or 190 billion 100-watt light bulb all the time turned on society. They will function that supports something smaller in tandem with depleting fossil fuels, but that's not how we're planning for them. The things I'm talking about in this call can't be voiced at the UN or at the IPCC or at the convening of parties or the Congress because they're too socially and politically difficult, because there are no solutions. There are multiple responses to the story I'm saying today, but they're not politically acceptable, at least not yet. Despite all that, there are many benign pathways yet that remain to us. We're one of the richest physical generations in history, and we could use a lot less energy and still get basic human needs. We just have to have more people joining this particular game board and seeing the map of the future with clear heads, which is what Thomas and Sebastian are trying to do, which is what I'm trying to do. 7 systemic concepts for investors and philanthropists. I'll briefly go through these. The first is the biophysical phase shift that we are undergoing. So we are in the midst of a cultural story that money and technology is what powers our existence. And the Ukraine-Russian situation is all of a sudden ripping off these energy blinders for a lot more people. And what this means is that commodities, energy, gold, things that you can't print, because the response by governments to these crises is going to be to print money. It's hard for me to imagine that any government will say, you know what, we've consumed beyond our means, we're going to go to austerity and tighten our belts, because they will lose optionality to other countries. So we are in the early stages of a massive shift in how people view the world. And this means that energy particularly, but also other commodities like copper and lithium and forest will start to become recognized as or more important than technology. Multipolar world and dollar hegemony. The US dollar is the world's reserve currency. It's all the oil in the world is priced in US dollars, or at least it has been. What's happening now with the Russian war is that I believe this war was 20% military and 80% economic. Russia knows that they are sitting on vast natural resources and that the rest of the world is dependent on those for their finished products. And so there are new systems whereby China and Russia will bypass the banking system that requires settlement in dollars to price um, oil in yuan or a basket of currencies. And this has major implications for the world order. We hear about the countries in the world that produce the most oil. The top three are the United States, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. But what we often don't hear is there's a difference between being an oil producer and an oil exporter. And the difference is that some countries use a lot of their own oil, so they don't have it for export. If we look at these graphs, natural gas on the left, oil on the right, these are the largest exporting countries. And notice that Russia exports 25% of the world's available for purchase gas and 22% of the world's available to purchase oil. If you combine Russia with Saudi Arabia, approaching 50% of the world's oil available for purchase from the rest of the world comes from those two countries. This is a massive implication for the coming world order and where the power, literally and figuratively, come from. My friend Kirill Sokolov runs an investment service called 13D, and one of his themes is called the Alliance of the Aggrieved. And this is going to be an increasing theme in coming decades. You're all aware of the colonialism story. This has been kind of swept under the carpet in an era where growth was available to everyone and the rising tide lifted all boats. But now there are many countries that are backing up China and being part of a new world order where China is saying, we'll be in equal terms. We would like to partner with your country. And this is kind of leaving the US and to a lesser extent Europe out of the conversation, because China and Russia and the BRICS are establishing, attempting this multipolar world order. So another aspect not often in the news is our pursuit of decarbonization because of climate change is going to lead to a rematerialization. We are going to need massive amounts of nickel and aluminum and copper and lithium and these things. Well, it turns out that most of the deposits of these resources are in countries that already have social problems, but are going to be accelerated by higher wet bulb temperature, heat waves, droughts, and the impacts from climate this decade already. So some of our mathematical engineering plans for replacing fossil fuels with renewables, even though that's not going to happen because the superorganism is very hungry, are going to run into a direct conflict between the global north and the global south. Energy security versus carbon decarbonization. This is a story, if you're living in Europe, you're well aware of. Germany, because it had to, is reopening coal plants, which is completely antithetical to environmental demands, and yet they have to. So I think the Ukraine situation was the start of a new move towards energy security and a move away from full decarbonization efforts. Asset allocation during the carbon pulse. Many of you on this call are investors, high net worth families. How do you think about the things that I've been talking about on this call? Well, historically, during a long period of growth, the standard investment recommendation was a 60-40 standard allocation, 60% stocks, 40% bonds. Where we're headed in this next decade in a phase shift is this old model I don't think will continue. I don't know what the right percentages are, but some combination of stocks, bond, commodities, and cash, because we don't know if we're headed for an inflationary hyperinflation or a deflationary depression. It's going to depend on a lot of things. But ultimately, the real story of our ecology is going to be made clear in coming decades, which is that finance is just a marker for the real things that matter in our system. And people want dollars or euros because they give you the most optionality to make quick decisions around the world. But ultimately, our wealth is our social capital, our natural capital, our built capital, and our human capital, our skills, our knowledge, our health. And why do we invest anyways? Part of it is to help industries have capital to create things for the future that society needs. Part of it is to earn a gazelle from a cheetah sort of biological optimal foraging return that makes us happy because we too are biological organisms. A big part of it is comparing ourselves to others, that we have more claims on the future than others do, and that gives us freedom and also status, etc. But will status in the future be represented by sheer digits in the bank is an open question. There may be different status symbols in the future, totally unrelated to how many resources there are. I think we're learning that beyond a certain minimum, that more energy and more money doesn't make us healthier or happier. This is Vaclav Smil's graph showing the energy supply per capita on the bottom axis versus the Human Development Index. And once you get to around 100 gigajoules per capita, there is very little hedonic well-being benefit to individuals or to a nation by adding more energy. For instance, Italy and the United States are around the same level of development, but the United States uses 3 times the energy as the average Italian. The same thing applies to humans. The average American uses 100 light bulbs worth of energy every single day versus the 1 light bulb, which is our human bodies. The first couple light bulbs worth of energy will power a cell phone or a computer. But as we get to the ones that require the ability to bake 2 turkeys at 3 in the morning if I can't sleep, is that really contributing to my well-being? So I think this is going to be, I think if people understand this dynamic, it could inform investments on what society is really going to demand and need in coming decades. Finally, we are alive at a very, very special time. And I think we have an outsized responsibility during this time. All of our governments, corporations, technology companies, and philanthropy are basing their future funding, grants, and projects on this trajectory continuing. Very few are looking at what decisions, what investments, what governance is appropriate for a biophysically smaller, less global future. So in my work, there are 3 main themes that we have to bend and not break. So this particularly is when there's a financial recalibration, how do we navigate that without a break, as Gaia was saying last week? How do we stabilize our populations that are mental well-being and local and regional supply chains and better information commons, et cetera? And simultaneously, how do we protect the roughly 10 million other species that we share this planet with and the productive ecosystems? These are the categories that I think about in the various vectors of my work. Finally, many of you on this call are philanthropists, someone with a lot of digital claims on actual surplus alive today. This is a very, very rare and special privilege and thing to have arrived at. And you listening to this in that position have degrees of freedom that most people do not have, that governments do not have. And so a pro-social, systems literate philanthropist is a terrible thing to waste. And I hope that in addition to managing your personal and your family investments, that you allocate some portion towards a pro-social outcome, because we want to propel things of value through the coming bottlenecks of the 21st century. Knowledge, culture, species, ecosystem, peace, stability, etc. That's all I had. I'll leave you with a final quote that from Ilya Prigogine, when a system is far from equilibrium, small islands of coherence can shift the entire system. Thank you.